Steve Rasnic Tem. In these final days of sales. Steve Rasnic Tem's stories have been published in numerous anthologies, including Meta-Horror, Forbidden Acts, Dark Terrors 3, The Best New Horror, and earlier volumes of the year's Best Fantasy and Horror, as well as in various magazines. He has had 2 collections published in English, City Fishing and The Far Side of the Lake. His novel, The Book of Days, was recently published by Subterranean Press. Also, Lone Wolf just released a multimedia CD, Imagination Box, by him and his wife, Melanie Tem. In These Final Days of Sales was originally published as a chapbook by the new publisher, Wormhole Books. E.D. Main thing is you're selling something those folks need, something they can't live without. It's not the bang in your buck, it's the buck in your bang. At the end of the commercial, the words blaze a brilliant white across the black screen, then fade. Emile remembers a time when clarity was of the utmost importance in sales, conventional wisdom being that people would not buy an unknown quantity. Of course, what they thought they were getting might not bear much resemblance to the object eventually delivered, wrapped in brown paper COD, but at least the transaction began with that image in mind, clear if erroneous. Now a certain degree of clairvoyance is required to discern what goods are actually being advertised. Emile himself, in the sales business, watches commercials in the hotel rooms along his route, trying to map out exactly what the rules are now. What troubles him most is that they seem to be not just about new sales techniques, but about a change in the human psyche itself. We have become the creatures in our dreams, he thinks, poured into pleasing and biodegradable packaging. People want something. That has been the message behind the message in every ad or commercial. You want something, they remind us. The ads advertise want. They advertise need. No wonder the actual product remains in the background. At some level, the advertisers have finally realized their products are merely symbolic, almost irrelevant. Much of the mysterious advertising, Emile has finally concluded, is for various brands of pants. After a few years, all the towns, all the countless burgs and villes line up like endless doors, opening one by one, and seem like the same town, the same main street, with the same row of worn brick or whitewashed wood on each side, the same people of pink or yellow or brown in their denims, corduroys, cottons, or polyesters, waving or not waving, depending on how friendly toward strangers they are feeling on this particular day. And yet, Emile, the professional salesman, has never really thought of himself as a stranger. That was the first thing he learned in sales. You cannot act like or think of yourself as a stranger. Not if they are going to trust you, not if they are going to buy. And how is buying any different from shaking a hand, giving a good how do you do, getting married, kissing the kids good night? Not much, when you really think about it. Just another form of social exchange, value for value. You rub my back, and I'll rub yours. You don't want to be left back on the shelf when everybody's buying. That's the very worst thing. You don't want to remain unsold all your life. Sometimes Emile is so intent he is on the eventual accounting that he forgets sales is more than that. It is a matter of wishes and dreams, of planning and foresight, of frustration and expectation. After years on the road, each town is exactly what he'd expected it to be. The streets are exactly what he'd imagined. The people are perfectly familiar because they've already walked these streets in one of his countless motel daydreams. It is as if, every day, the citizens of these tiny communities rebuild their town according to his expectations, anticipating his particular arrival. Given how self-centered human beings are, this is no doubt a common misperception. It is one of the first things you learn as a salesman, and if you are good at your job, you use it to your advantage. Emile is not good at his job. In fact, if there is a worse salesman out there on the road, Emile has not yet met him. The man with the off-kilter eyes fills the screen with a loopy grin. A dolly back to reveal the rest of the family. The wife rubbing up against him in her new red dress, barely able to contain herself. The kids jumpy. Emile thinks the boy may have peed his pants. They are all holding up great wads of fake cash to the camera. The portrait on one of the bills resembles Clark Gable more than any president Emile can think of. And yet these people are so thrilled to have it in their hands. They jump around as if affected by some nervous disease. Having little tolerance any more for the manic patter of commercials, he keeps the volume down as he watches the television family pantomime surprise, joy, delirium. They've gotten what they've always wanted. Failing that, perhaps they can rent it, if it's still available, if they can ever figure out what it is. He really shouldn't make fun, he thinks. If people didn't behave this way, if they stopped looking for something to make them happy, they wouldn't buy. Of course, people seldom buy from him in any case. In fact, Emile has come to think of himself as the anti-salesman, like some supervillain with a huge gray cape and unpleasant teeth. Emile has in his pocket a letter from an old salesman he used to meet out on the road a couple of times a year. Their paths might cross in Goodland or in Hugo, perhaps even in Kansas City. Supposedly, Walt had been quite successful in his time, but Emile knows him only as this tired-looking fellow who might have been a retired teacher or someone recently recovered from a lengthy illness. Emile, this is a job offer of sorts. Not for a specific job, really, but it is the promise of a job, a good job with regular hours and good benefits. And there's no travel involved. My friends and I have had this dream we've developed over years on the road, a dream built a stick at a time in hotel rooms and all-night diners, of someday having our own town, a factory outlet town where customers would come to you to buy the things they really needed to buy. So no sales pitches, or how many should I put you down fors? Why, any pressure, high or low, would simply be out of the question. We need salesmen to run the stores of this new town, trained salesmen who have become more interested in helping people than they are in earning high commissions. Emile has taken this letter out and unfolded it and reread it so many times, it threatens to fragment into a dozen or so worn paper squares, held together by a few commas and dashes. He has never visited this new town. It just makes him feel good, knowing that it is there. Sometimes Emile fantasizes that he will find a way to sneak back and catch the residents of a town unawares. Then he will find out exactly what each of these places is really like. Perhaps at last he will discover what people really think about him. The thought is both exciting and dreadful. Emile's career in sales hasn't always been like this. In the beginning, he never knew what to expect when he arrived in a new town. It had been interesting. It had made him anxious. He never knew if he'd find hell or paradise. Most of the time it had been neither, of course, a necklace of gray towns and gray people, but at least that heady anticipation had always been there. The main thing is— Jack looked around for a place to spit. Emile moved his feet out of the way. Finally the old man looked over his shoulder and spat behind him. Main thing is you're selling something those folks need, something they can't live without. I don't want to lie to anybody, Emile had said. Lie? Who said anything about lying, boy? I don't want you to lie, for Christ's sake. Who knows what anybody needs? I don't know what you need. Are you arrogant enough to tell me you know what I need? Do you really know what you need? I doubt it. Even occasional self-knowledge is a rare thing, boy. It's luck, pure and simple. So don't talk to me about lies. Guesses would be more accurate. I don't even know what I'm selling, Emile said. That's because I haven't told you yet, boy." Jack pulled an oft-creased, yellowing square of paper out of his back pants pocket. Ignoring the tiny paper slivers that flaked off and littered the floor, he unfolded it again. When it was about a yard square, he stopped and pressed his nose against it. The paper was so worn and discolored, it made Emile think of a thin layer of old skin. He could practically read Jack's expression through the huge square. The wrinkled forehead, the pursed lips, the mushy, dark gray eyes like a baby's. But Emile couldn't make out any of the writing, or even if there was any writing. "There's some difference of opinion on this." Jack's voice raised and lifted the paper as if it were a floating tissue. "But encyclopedias are best for a beginner, I suspect. You're offering them the world of knowledge, the flying carpet to distant lands, all of that for just a few bucks a month. Just gotta remember that with encyclopedias, you only call on people who have kids." "Because most adults think their learning days are over," Emile added helpfully. "Something like that. Tell me, are you willing to learn, or do you just want to put your own 2 cents in?" "Oh, yes, I want to learn, really." It was just to be a short-term job following graduation, something to put food in his mouth and a roof over his head until something better came along. "Okay, then. The thing about selling encyclopedias is you can convince them they need to buy a set for their kids' futures. Everybody wants to do things for the future of their kids. In this country, we spoil them rotten." Emile's own parents had begrudged him every penny. You would have thought they might have found the cure for cancer if only they hadn't had to worry about their only son. If he ever had children, if he ever could convince a woman he was worth raising a family with, he'd surely buy them a set of encyclopedias. A whole damn library. You could not do enough for your kids. "You'd buy your own kids' encyclopedias, wouldn't you? I mean, if you had any?" It was as if the old man read his mind. A good salesman, according to that first training manual, could tell when interest had peaked, when the customer was growing bored, as well as determine the particular magic phrase that might turn sales and lives around. "Oh, well, of course, if I had the money." "Even if you didn't have the money, you'd do it. You'd find a way somehow. Now, don't tell me that you wouldn't." "Well, you're right." "See, now, that's what I'm talking about. In this country we buy our kids things, especially if we have even the vaguest notion it'll give them a better life than what we've had. Something bright and shiny and fluttering with color and motion. That's pretty much the American way." Jack somehow found an opportunity to drop the word American into practically every conversation, his particular style of sales patter. Emile wasn't sure he himself had his own style, even after all these years, except that it involved a great deal of sitting, of daydreaming through visits in old-fashioned parlors and newly decorated living rooms, waiting for a change in the air, or the light, or the order of the universe. "You know, I've never sold anything before," Emile said. "Sure you have. Like everybody else, you've been selling all your life. The question is whether you've been giving the people good value." Sales had been as unlikely an occupation for someone of Emile's temperament as anything he might imagine. He'd gone on very few dates, unable to sell himself to women. He'd been passed over for the simplest jobs because he'd been unable to sell himself to employers. Whatever friends he had acquired seemed largely accidental. He had no aptitude for closing the deal, shaking the hand, laughing at the obligatory jokes. It was the world's sense of humor that had brought him into sales after graduation. You understood that sort of thing if you were a salesman. So it had all come down to the day he'd picked up his sample set at the warehouse, along with the brochures and studies proving how kids raised on encyclopedias had increased IQ, appetite, and stamina, and set out his first time on the road using the route map the old man had given him. Instead of the usual dots or squares to represent towns and cities, there were little drawings of houses, all of them the same size, crude, yet childishly cheerful, pastel yellows and blues and pinks. When he examined those tiny houses with his magnifying glass, he spied children's faces in the windows of several, here and there a smiling mother or father out on the lawn, baby brother in a stroller, the shirtless neighbor watering his lawn. A tiny blotch of ink that might have been a dog or a cat. A company-owned car was provided for his first trip out. Imagine, a company car! But he was alarmed to discover a broad scrape along the length of the passenger side and cracks in the windows. "They want you to keep that passenger side parked away from your customers' houses at all times," the chief dispatcher informed him. The brown dashboard had enough cracks in it to fill a dried-out riverbed. The clock was missing an hour hand. If he scrunched sideways against the steering wheel, he could just see that missing hand reclining in the bottom scoop of the dial. The seat and back had even more cracks, futilely repaired with a variety of tapes that caught and pulled at his neatly pressed suit. Out on the road he realized that major cities, New York, St. Louis, Philadelphia, Chicago, weren't even depicted on the map. "We like to leave the big places for the veterans," Jack had told him. Now and then, over the years, he would come to a town that felt far more familiar than most. With a B name like Bennett or Bailey or Baxter, it would be a town with ambition. The main street in the process of restoration, new motels and restaurants at the outskirts, and at least one new mall. A construction sign just outside town limits advertises a multiplex. Overpriced townhomes are being erected along the distant foothills. Emile has met the desk clerk at the cheapest hotel and asks about the health of his youngest daughter. The clerk does not act surprised. At the bake sale outside the post office, the woman in the bright yellow dress sells him a small bag of ginger snaps for the 8th time this year. In the windows of the hardware store are pictures of missing children. It is an epidemic. He wonders about the strangers who steal children out of the Baileys and Baxters and Bennetts of the world. Perhaps the kidnapper is an airline pilot, he thinks. Perhaps he is the representative of some obscure government regulatory agency. Perhaps he is a traveling salesman who was lost in the identical towns and quiet streets of America. It never occurs to him that anyone might suspect him any more than it would occur to him to commit such a crime. The automobile on the flickering screen is unlike any Emile has ever seen. So sleek, so modern, it appears to drive itself, passing without damage through tornadoes, mudslides, nuclear attacks. The message of the commercial is that a person could not die in such a vehicle. Death has always been the big mistake, the nasty trick, the unacceptable penalty. Emile believes if he just didn't have to die, he might someday become a successful human being. Now, in these final days of salesmanship, Emile is on his 26th company car. He knows this from the files of paperwork in a cardboard box in the back seat. He wonders if bad driving is one of the byproducts of salesmanship. This pushing through the highways and byways of the assigned route, whatever the weather or road conditions. This nervous and careless passing, this incessant hurry to get nowhere. If it all came down to driving habits, he'd have been declared the perfect salesperson a long time ago. But he has no talent for sales. He sometimes wonders what kind of man he must be to spend his life dedicated to something he is so poor at. But if he has learned anything at all in his wanderings, it is that life itself, for most of humanity, is this constant doing and undoing, doing poorly at what we attempt, undoing the better efforts of those who have come before us. Still, survival requires food for the mouth, a pillow for the head, motion of the eye, and a new day's list of prospects for the brain to process. In these last few days of salesmanship, his lack of aptitude cannot be helped. In these last few days of salesmanship, there are many more towns to investigate, hotel rooms to rent, long hours to spend waiting on the couches and good chairs in the living rooms of America, meditating through the afternoons in quiet contemplation of the people who need everything and nothing. He means no criticism in this. It is simply the life we live in these last days of sales, trying not to think too much about the small tragedies or joys. The sound at the door is more a rubbing or a scraping than a knocking. He hesitates to open it. No one knows he is here except the clerk. A small old lady of gray flesh peers up at him beyond the dire weight of her glasses. "I just wanted to thank you for that new Bible you sold me," she tells him, and lifts her head to kiss him on the cheek, exposing the ragged hole in her throat. He tries to close the door on her, but she shoves the shiny red-leather Bible between the door and the jamb. He turns to escape and trips over his sample case. She drapes herself over him, whispering, "I just want you to sell me again," and he is appalled to discover the erection growing like an impending purchase beneath his belt. "Remember that there's a pit waiting for you in self-pity, so put that I in try and get back on your feet and run." The cheers, the applause, the feet stampings are so loud, Emile is compelled to fiddle with the volume control. It takes some time for him to figure out that the dark-haired man on the screen is not a preacher, but a salesman like himself. Or not like himself, for this man is wildly successful the world over. The man sells tapes and books and a correspondence course of some sort, but even more clever than that, Emile suddenly realizes, the man is selling people back to themselves. An incredible idea, an endless supply of product with so little overhead. There is a sadness about it all, he thinks, but who is he to say? Who is he to even have an opinion on such matters? That A in ambition is as high as any mountain, but climb it anyway. Don't eat the pear in despair. Remember, there's no hope in dope. Take that H out of whining and you'll be winning. Emile cannot understand why the company has never fired him. In all his years on the road, he has never once met his quota. And yet he has been allowed to continue making contacts, meeting prospects, conversing for long, leisurely days in the living rooms and on the front porches of America. Periodically, the Home Office sends out trainers, usually men, whose job is to sharpen the skills of the sales force. He isn't sure what their real job is. Half the time they make no pretense of training. Just as he suspects, their courtships of his customers are for the most part rewarded. It is amazing, sometimes frightening, to watch as the salesman nods, and the customers nod in return, as smile echoes smile and laughter echoes laughter, as the customers slowly transform into salesmen doppelgangers, and a good time is had by all, except for Emile, who stands by the door and attempts to shake off his anxiety. Many of the salesmen appear to achieve their success by means of sheer animal dominance. These are the alpha males, and although the herd of customers may mimic the salesman's gestures to the point of slavishness, they can never hope to match the salesman in strength or confidence. Other salesmen, at first glance, appear to be no more impressive than Emile, but they are persistent almost to the point of their and Emile's humiliation. He spends one appalling afternoon camped out on a front porch, the fox-like salesman with the wired eyes refusing to leave until the elderly couple has purchased something. The husband gives in with shaking hands and cornered eyes. A few of the men the company sends are interrogators, and they grill many of his prospects as to their needs and dreams, why they were at all hesitant to buy such a fine product. They use the customer's own hesitations and rationalizations against them. And there are those for whom Emile can think of no better word than crazed, the ones who affect a certain delirium, dancing a jig, forcing facial spasms, singing spontaneously and inappropriately, that so troubles the customers they buy what they can in order to get rid of them. Emile, of course, is unlike any of these salespeople. There is no good reason for the company to retain him, and yet he remains year after year, hoping for the blessed dismissal that will free him, which he cannot ask for himself, and which never comes. And here he is again, the wife on the couch making polite conversation, the husband puttering around in the next room, pretending to make repairs, but whose real business is to listen in on the wife's dealings and make sure she does not spend too much of their rapidly disappearing funds. The wife has no real desire to buy, except out of politeness or pity. Her real need is to have someone to talk to about the children, share her memories of the sister's dead baby, her own medical troubles, her thinly disguised fears that her world is a precarious thing about to end, and her husband will not listen, has not really listened in years. Outside it is a kind of Kansas, although they are miles and years from that state. Sun burning the distant edges of crops, the horse moving slowly across the hill, the small boy on his bicycle struggling through mud ruts deep enough to swallow his wheels. Soon the wife will offer her final apologies. So many unexpected expenses of late, folks hereabouts having pretty hard times. Such a good product, it's really too bad we don't have the money to spare. I'm afraid we can't see our way, and it's not your fault at all. And he will happily be free once again to step outside and stride to his car, relieved that he will not have to fill out all the paperwork that an actual sale entails. So, my husband agrees we should take one at that discount rate you said you were offering today, one time only, and not to be repeated, and who could pass up such a bargain? I mean, really. Emile stares at the young wife, as if she has suddenly gone crazy, as if she's been spitting and drooling and speaking in tongues. But in fact she is an older woman, graying at the temples, and wearing an old-fashioned housecoat, fading into transparency around the hem. He cannot understand. It is as if he's nodded off with the unending familiarity of his own sales spiel, and the woman's mother has replaced her in the chair. He gazes around the vaguely familiar room and sees her elderly husband slumped forward in his overstuffed chair, sleeping or dead. "Just a minute," he finally manages to say through a rising panic. "Just a goddamn minute." Has he really cursed a customer? "I've got my order book here somewhere. We'll get you fixed right up. Yes, indeed, you won't be sorry about this purchase. No, ma'am. It's the gift that keeps on giving, the key to a lifetime of success, the satisfaction of knowing you're doing, well, what you're doing. It's the cap on the toothpaste, the bridge." Emile's hand flops about in the worn-out leather satchel like a broken sparrow. He's not sure what he's seeking. In fact, cannot remember the last time he'd reached into his sales valise, when his fingers seize the tattered edges of the sales book and retrieve it carefully, as if it were some moth losing wing scales in frightening amounts. He spreads it open on his lap, carefully positioning the disintegrating slip of carbon paper, writes 1 as the quantity, then stops. What is he selling this woman? He looks at her expectantly. "You wanted one—" His dry tongue adheres to his bottom lip. She smiles so broadly he thinks her mind is, in fact, gone, and he will not have to complete the order form after all. But then she nods slowly, happily, as if perfectly aware that she is doing the right thing for herself and the generations to come. For the briefest of seconds he is unable to pull his tongue from his lip, and when finally he does, it is so painful he feels a tear balanced dangerously in the corner of one eye. 1, he repeats, and looks around for the sample he has been showing her, but it is nowhere to be seen. "Deluxe edition," she finally replies, so he knows it isn't the sports weather vane or the Speedo pocket groomer or 5 of the 12 handy household helpers he sells or used to sell. If he could only remember what it was he was selling this trip out, what he had put into his sample case, but there is nothing there, and nothing anywhere to be seen but this giant book bound in red leather she grasps so lovingly in her 2 trembling hands. "I only wish our son Johnny would read this with us. So long he has been away from the Lord." 1 deluxe Bible, red leather, with the special painted map inserts, tracing Jesus' path through our mortal world, Emile says confidently, writing 1 RB onto the pad. He settles back, calmed, as the elderly woman, but he recognizes her now, remembering how he had stopped here when she was a young bride, and realizes how much she must regret not having bought that Bible the first time he came by, when her baby was still a magical creature of hope and possibility, drones on about the sorry affairs of her son, the all-too-familiar litany of failures and small betrayals. Gazing out the window, Emile sees a small blond boy on a backyard swing, perhaps this woman's grandchild, or impossibly her son at a better age, conjured up by her sad monologue. Emile rises from the chair. The woman does not seem to care or notice, while the husband continues his uninterrupted rehearsal for death, and climbs out the window, strides across the bright lawn bordered in corn, and sits in the child's other swing, the one reserved for playmates yet to arrive. "It's too nice a day to be indoors," he says, both an explanation and an introduction. "Who are you?" the little boy asks, staring up at Emile's face. Emile gazes out over the endless and precisely aligned rows of corn. The sun glazes the leaves a green gold, and he feels a smile travel unbidden across his face. "I'm nobody, really," he finally replies. "Just a salesman calling on your parents with my promises and offers, my bag full of hope and secrets." Suddenly stern, the boy says in an old man's querulous voice, "Are you going to try and sell me something?" Emile is startled. He has been asked the question before, and it never fails to upset him. "No, no," the salesman in him lies. "I'm not selling anything today." "And what are you doing here?" "I'm spending time here in this swing. I'm the customer this afternoon, buying myself a piece of this beautiful day." The boy stares intently over the corn, as if seeing a body hanging from the line of the horizon. When he looks back at Emile, his expression is eager. "So, you've been to a lot of different places, not just here?" "More places than I can count, son. I hope you don't mind the familiar." "And the people in these places? They're all different in these places?" "Well, you know, it's funny that you should ask that, young man. It's been my experience that people are the same the world over, subject to the same wants and needs, accessible by the same techniques." "No, you're lying," the boy shouts. "Tell me that they're different. They have to be different from here." "Well," Emile scrambles for the right words that will calm the boy, that will sell him some peaceful behavior. "We wouldn't understand each other too well, now would we, if we were all that different from each other?" "Get off my swing!" Alarmed, Emile trips getting out of the swing and sprawls on the ground. He heads back toward the open window, dusting off his pants as he goes. Behind him the boy sobs, but Emile will not let himself turn around. Customers don't like it when you watch them cry. He climbs back through the window and slips into the chair. Spying a strand of berry-weed stuck to one dress sock, he leans forward to remove it. The woman continues narrating her list of sadnesses. But it is not the same woman. This woman is younger, a brunette, and although the room is of the same style as the previous one, there are differences. This husband is livelier than the other one. He rushes back and forth, a gun in his hand. "You hear that?" After some delay, Emile realizes the question is addressed to him. And then he does hear something coming from outside. Gunshots and shouting, the alarmed cries of animals. "What?" "It's that Wilkins boy, Johnny. He shot his ma and pa, and now he's killing all the livestock in sight." Emile can hear a rumbling engine between the shotgun blasts. "But he's just a boy." 16 if he's a day. Old enough to blow a stranger's head off if he's dumb enough to stick his head outside. Guess he didn't read those encyclopedias you sold them 10 years ago." Crazily, Emile wonders if the Wilkinses had purchased their easy annual update volume subscription plan. It has been designed to keep your youngster apprised of all the latest developments, not only in the sciences, but in the arts as well. An hour later, it is all over. Emile cannot remember if this family has placed an order or not. But there is such a relief in leaving a customer's house, he could care less. It is the best he ever feels. Emile comes out of the house, feeling that now would be a good time to take a walk, a relaxed stroll through a friendly neighborhood where he has lived all his married life. Their kids know his kids. They don't always get along, but they play together every day, and he sees the parents at the grocery, in church, and every other Wednesday night for bowling. They aren't exactly friends, but there is a kind of comfort in these small, recurrent encounters. It is a good life, if you avoid looking too many steps ahead. When he sees his battered black Buick parked at the curb, he recalls that he is a salesman, has never been married, and has very few friends to speak of. His key sticks and hangs as if the lock mechanism has not been used in some time. He is careful not to strain the key too far as he manipulates it against the roughness of the internal workings, and finally there is a giving and a surprised suction as he jerks open the door. Inside, the air is as thick and cloying as the air trapped in a dead grandmother's old trunk, and the fast food wrappers layering the floor appear to have been there for years. He sits in a bed of dust, as soft and thick as another layer of upholstery. He has no hope of starting this vehicle. This is a dead machine, designed for the transportation of the dead. He puts his key into the ignition and turns it anyway. There are no signs of electrical activity. He gets out of the car and looks under the hood. The engine appears to have been ripped out ages ago. When he calls the main office, he is too embarrassed to tell them that the car is an ancient piece of junk that has not been driven in years, because, of course, this would make no sense. He simply reports that his career in sales has outlived another vehicle and that he will need a replacement. They authorize a budget, and he picks a used car dealer at random from the phone book. His only criterion is that it is within walking distance. He waits at a safe distance from the car lot and watches as people drive in, are greeted in rapid succession by eager, excited salespeople, are spirited away to the cars that will change their lives, the cars that were made for them and them alone, with bucket seats, SRS brakes, extras and more than extras, the cars that will strain their marriages and bankrupt them. Many of these customers already know the possible end result of their reasonable time payment purchases, are perhaps even determined that it not happen to them again, and yet they will be so excited, so agitated by the experience and all the grand possibilities, they will be absolutely thrilled to pay more and more for less and less. Emile has an advantage. For so many of these people, a new car means a new life, transportation out of bad decisions and past mistakes. For him, it is simply a continuation of the long, sad trip he has been on all of his life. He waits until the right couple comes in driving the roughest, most battered vehicle he has seen in years. But it does not smoke, and there is no obvious wobble as it pulls in front of the dealership. An hour later they drive away in a bright blue teardrop of promise, and he walks across the street and into the sales office. "What do you mean that doesn't include floor mats?" speaks a surprised voice out of a tiny office to his left. "I want to buy that car there," Emile says to the first salesman to approach him. "Excuse me, sir?" Emile might have asked to buy a tombstone in a shoe shop. "That car there." The salesman glances over Emile's shoulder without much interest. "Must be a trade-in. It hasn't been worked up yet." Emile struggles to look the man directly in the eyes. "That's the one I want." The salesman attempts to stare him down in the friendliest possible way. "What if I told you I could get you into a better car for less money?" "You and I both know how much it's worth," Emile says a little shakily. "Take that figure and add 15%. He forces himself to pause and looks even more directly at the man. He isn't sure if he's pulled off a smile. "I'm a salesman, too, since college. It's the only job I've ever had." The car salesman nods, unimpressed, and Emile decides this has been a failure. "I'll have to take this to my manager," the salesman says, and for an unreal moment Emile thinks he is about to be arrested. Emil gazes after the man as he enters another office, waits anxiously as the salesman confers unemotionally with his boss, who glances up at Emil only once, then down at a notepad. The boss gives the salesman a piece of paper, who carries it out to Emil and puts it into his hand. He almost expects the car to stall out as he drives it out of the lot, which would be embarrassing but survivable. Studying the violent screen flickers of these motel room TVs, Emil has developed a theory that these sporadic discharges of light are part of an attempt to hypnotize the viewer into buying whatever product is being discussed. This sales maneuver is doubly clever because these residents are generally poor travelers who cannot afford to leave their rooms. They watch these commercials in a state of desperate exhaustion. A collage of images impresses onto the tired and ill-used tissue of his brain. Children, small, tidy houses, walks in the park with the family dog, vacations at the beach. Be a Man floats eerily across the screen, in colors muted to suggest a whisper. What are they selling? There is no way to determine. Whatever it is certainly something he does not have. Are you ready? In bolder than bold type shouts at him from the screen. He waits for the kicker, the product revelation, the final sales pitch before he is returned to their regularly scheduled program. But there is no return. There is no change. The words remain frozen, oppressive, unforgiving, even when he unplugs the television in frustration. Emil is traveling I-70 just outside Salinas when he sees the billboard, the City of Commerce, with a huge red arrow perched on top. The sign is somewhat worn, but he thinks maybe this is from the road construction he's seen in the area over the past year. He thinks of the letter folded up in his pocket, and he turns onto the access road, all black and shiny with promise. He might quit his job this very day, call the company office, and have them pick up the car and his samples, if they care to bother. He passes no cars on the road, and considers the afternoon heat, and thinks this must be a slow time for shopping traffic. He spies the gleaming steel tower from a couple of miles away, a variety of buildings spread about its base, like flowers planted around an airport control tower. In the afternoon sun, everything gleams like a nest of needles. Just before he turns onto the main street, another large sign appears, Welcome to the City of Commerce, with a picture of a happy little girl gesturing to the wonders behind her. Alice in Wonderland, he thinks, and the artist's vision of the shopping center confirms the notion. It might easily grace the cover of some edition of something by Carroll or Baum. Emil is bewildered by the cold tears he feels leaking from his eyes. What is happening to him? He should just turn around. City of Commerce, indeed. It almost makes him laugh. Then he sees the bullet holes above the little girl's head, almost making a halo. The torn passages through the faded backdrop of the city. A turn onto the main street of the City of Commerce confirms that the place has been abandoned for some time. The finished buildings appear empty, and the unfinished buildings ready to collapse beneath their architecturally unsound frameworks. He has nothing better to do, never did have, so he continues his leisurely drive past the vast fields of asphalt. The streets appear to have been laid out with remarkable care. A perfect grid of block after block of abandoned buildings, partially finished constructions, lots full of dried-up landscaping, mounds of mysterious concrete. In one place, a huge outdoor skating rink. Remarkable! Ice skating in Kansas, the signs scream. Now it looks like a large, shallow swimming pool with no water, much less ice. Remarkable indeed. The abandoned construction sites in particular draw Emil's eye. Much of the time he cannot tell what the building was intended to be. Multiple girders jut out sideways in parallel like huge claws taking a swipe at the sky. Roof lines twist and turn like the skeletons of roller coasters. Giant square passages where walls might have been form windows for watching the world change color. Enormous Mondrian sculptures line up like a fleet of cubist spaceships. He parks along one street of gravel and sand and peers through the great transparent teeth of a clownish building with round window eyes. The swirling pink and orange paint job within makes him think of an ill child after a day's overeating at the circus. What might they sell in such places? The fact that the buildings are relatively new, unlike those in the western ghost towns of old, fills him with a peculiar dissonance, as if he is hearing dozens of ill-tuned chimes playing nearby. He turns the corner and is face to knee with a silver metal beaver at least a dozen feet tall. Beside it, and still gigantic at half the beaver's size, is a brilliant white fiberglass baseball. The beaver's eyes are wide and staring, as if it is as surprised to see this baseball as a meal is. He can find no specific business these statues might be attached to, and therefore assumes this must be some sort of installation of public art. He wonders about what the customers must have thought of these two objects, for ever how long this place had customers. As he walks past the rows of storefronts, it occurs to him how insubstantial everything seems, the empty stores like huge display boxes having no value without their goods. The wind thunders against the expanse of glass and shiny metal. There are no indications of residences, of schools, or of any other structure where the day in and day out of life might take place. But, of course, this is the city of commerce, a container for commercials and impulsive retail exchange. Now even the signs indicating what might have gone on here are gone. One door is slightly ajar. Emile tugs it lightly and slips inside. This one has been occupied at one time. The outlines of counters and shelving decorate the floor. Dead electrical cables dangle where light fixtures have been removed. Here and there lie a candy wrapper or a bit of a magazine, gray tracks in the dust where small creatures have roamed. There has been surprisingly little vandalism. "You don't belong here," the dry voice speaks from behind. Emile turns to see a man with one hand poised over a holster. "Hey, easy now," Emile says softly. I have an invitation, I guess, to work here." He slides one finger into his front pants pocket, fishing for the paper, careful to let the guard see the rest of the hand. He retrieves the letter and extends it. The guard shakes his head. "Not necessary. I didn't think you were the stealing type anyway. You're the salesman type. I've seen a lot of you around here, sniffing around. All of them had letters like yours." Emile puts the paper back into his pocket. "What's to steal around here anyway?" The guard looks around the vast room as if for the first time. "Fixtures," he says, with a hint of sadness. Emile walks past the guard and out the door. Then he pauses. "How long?" "Oh, about 3 years." "What happened?" The guard smiles a little. "They had a huge supply of what people didn't want." On the otherwise unnaturally quiet walk back to his car, Emile finds himself chuckling aloud. In these last few days of sales, generous discounts can be offered, bonus gifts pulled out of the dusty trunk and placed into hesitant buyers' hands. In these last few days of sales, he is full of compliments and important news for everyone's family. In these last few days of sales, he represents the church, the school, and a benevolent government. In these last few days of sales, he cannot remember what he is selling, nor does he recognize the odd objects in his sample case. In these last few days of sales, he cannot bring himself to ask, "Which do you like best, and how many should I put you down for?" In these last few days of sales, he knows that sometimes a customer just wants a warm body to talk to. In these last few days of sales, he sees all the lonely people on his list, all the sad people for whom his brief visit is a major event. He has been traveling for quite a long time. Of course, he thinks, you're a career salesman. You've been traveling forever. Towns have died during the time he has been a salesman. Local economies have been disrupted. Great masses of people have lost their definition, reduced to reading self-help volumes and watching far too many movies. Everyone he meets is desperate to sell, but so many are reluctant to buy, having been disappointed so many times, having been cheated and lied to, having been murdered for their dreams and ambitions. The towns he passes through are painted in "for sale" signs. People have moved on ahead of him. Those left behind in the streets walk aimlessly with eyes like dull pennies. In these last few days of sales, he yearns to complete one last transaction. Coming upon the white-haired man out on the street thrills him as nothing has in years. He lets the man have one last swig from his bottle, then props him against the wall. The old man resembles Jack, the fellow who trained him years ago, but he resembles the guard at the City of Commerce as well. He may resemble the salesman who built the City of Commerce, but Emile doesn't know how they might have aged. He resembles most old men Emile has ever known. Perhaps he resembles Emile himself, who has not looked at his own face for a long time. "You only want the best for them," he begins. "Your children, your grandchildren. And if you don't have children, it's the children of others you want to thrive. Is this not so? Because then you can believe that something of this life will go on, and do well, and make of itself a thing of beauty against the failing of the light. For what else is there but the spark of us carried by children into the lands where we will never travel? And so you buy them things, grand things your own parents could never afford. And you hand these things to them as if you were handing down sacrifices and offerings to some fierce and unstoppable god. Take these things I have given you and do well, you say. Make my dreams into something capable of movement and breath, and do not damage me. Make no attempt to rob me of my last remaining dignities, because I swear I only wish you well. And that's the best you can do. That's the best any of us can do in these final days of sales." Placing his sample case on the concrete in front of the old man, he goes into the trunk of his car and hauls out box after box of Bibles and encyclopedias, grand dictionaries full of ideas he has never been able to express, baskets of outdated kitchen accessories which have lost both their utility and their names, perfumes and cleansers, small gifts for every occasion. The old man stares drunkenly at the salesman, unable to manage even a thank you. The salesman walks away empty-handed, leaving all the voices, all the give and takes, and the "I've got something special for you's" behind, knowing full well that he will not have to sell himself to the rain or the wind or the ground with its daily increase in gravity. And there is a peace in knowing that not all deals have to be closed. From the outside, his home looks no different from all the others. This is the way he wants it. There is a comfort in the cloning of every house he has ever seen on television. The slavish duplication of columns and brickwork, the same angled roofs repeated again and again across the horizon to become a geometry of reassurance. Emile has no reason to leave his house. The company pension provides for him quite comfortably. Why he should be receiving a pension, why they should reward decades of poor salesmanship, he has no idea. But then reward and punishment has always been a puzzle he is unable to solve. Groceries can be delivered relatively cheaply from the smaller stores. Items may be ordered over the phone, even without a catalogue. He will work from lists of merchandise, but pictures of anything are forbidden in his house. He receives a daily newspaper, but pays the man next door a handsome sum to censor it for him until the paper is like lace in his hands, beautiful in its way as shreds of celebrities and the dire news of the world allow the morning sunlight to pass through, making intricate shadowscapes on his formica kitchen table. He spends much of his day walking around naked. He has grown increasingly uncomfortable with clothing. Even the plainest garment seems to evoke one style or another, and then he feels he is wearing packaging and cannot breathe until it is shed. Without clothes, he can clearly see the damage that wraps him. There are cracks in his lower face and left arm from hours driving directly into the sun. There is dry and flaky skin across his chest and abdomen that no one has touched in years. There is an arthritic right hand that burns and freezes in the position of one asking for money. Several of his toes are missing. He does not remember what he did with them. He has lost the full range of motion in his left arm. His left leg twists awkwardly inward, making it painful to maneuver up and down steps. I didn't even sell these things, he thinks. I was never that good. My arms, my legs, my hands, my heart pulled and squeezed. I just gave them all away. His front doorbell rings. He peers out a nearby window. A small boy, staggering under the weight of a large box, looking up at Emil's closed door forlornly, as if behind it lies the only safety the boy has ever known, and yet the door must seem hundreds of miles away. Emil wraps a towel around himself and goes to greet his visitor. The boy's eyes grow huge when he sees Emil, but he musters his courage. "Sir, I'm trying to earn extra money this summer selling these fine candies." "Son," Emil crouches next to the boy, careful not to expose himself. "People are scared. They're scared everywhere he's ever been, and he doesn't want them to get the wrong idea. Son, listen. You've got to get my attention first. Then you've got to pique my interest." "Pique, sir?" "Then you have to show me some conviction. Then you have to kindle my desire. And finally you have to close the deal. Nothing really happened here today if you can't manage that last part. It was all just a dream, one big fantasy if there's no closing. AICDC, son. Attention, interest, conviction, desire, close. Remember that." Emil realizes the boy is staring at his belly. Poor salesmanship, drawing the prospect's attention to his own faults. "So are you going to buy a candy bar, mister?" "Say I do buy a candy bar from you. What are you going to do with the money? Are you going to save that money, son?" "I'm going to go to the movies with it if you buy a box of 'em. 6 a box, $10. "Okay, then. I'll buy 2 boxes. "Do you have a wallet, sir?" the boy asks skeptically. "I own a wallet, even a pocket in a pair of pants to keep it in. I probably even sold myself that pair of pants. I don't always walk around naked, you know." The boy continues to stare at him. Emil stares back. Finally, Emil asks, "Do I give you the money first, or do you give me the candy bars first? Any more, I'm not so good at this commerce thing." When they find him a week later, only half the candy bars have been consumed. The property is on the market for several years before it finally sells, longer than any listing the local realtors can remember. In fact, the poorly painted "For Sale" sign becomes a familiar landmark that the neighbors actually miss when it is gone.